Hello Substreamers and welcome back to Substream. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that has been sizzling on my mind. It's very juicy and there's a lot of meat on the bones of this story. Except there's no meat on these bones because we're talking about lab-grown meat. So stick around if you're interested in finding out more about how and why scientists are trying to grow meat for consumption in laboratories. Let's go. So for decades, the idea of meat grown in laboratories has come straight out of sci-fi. Some kind of futuristic movies would cover this concept. Now it's my turn to cover this concept. I want to go through the history. I want to show you more information than you may have heard, because who knows where you get your information from these days. I've done a lot of research into this topic and I'm going to break it down for you and hopefully you're going to enjoy it. Lab-grown meat, that might be the term that you've become used to, but the actual term is cultivated meat, or even cell-based meat if we're going to get a bit scientific here, which we are. Why cultivated meat? Well, that's because it's cultivated in a scientific controlled environment to try and create meat without killing animals, right? That is the root of this. It goes deeper than that, of course. It's kind of rooted in the idea that food security might become complex on planet Earth as the population grows, as we face climate crises and the likes. So the idea that we could grow meat in a lab and source our protein perhaps more ethically is, pretty innovative and disruptive. Now, I did say that this idea came out of sci-fi, but when I looked into the history to try and find out where this idea is rooted from, there's not huge amounts of information. But what I did find is that in 1931, Winston Churchill claimed that one day we would all be like eating chicken parts grown in labs. He predicted this future nearly 100 years ago, which I think is quite interesting. But when it comes to actual progress and implementation and, scientists trying to do this, it wasn't until like the late 20th century, around the 90s, early 2000s, the first actual project, let's say, was done by NASA, as far as I can find, creating fish cells for astronauts, because obviously in space you cannot get any more food unless someone sends up another rocket with food on it. So the idea that they could grow fish meat in space was the birth of cultivated meat. Behind the scenes, for decades, things were going on, trying different stuff. And there was an aha moment in 2013. There's Professor Mark Post. He claimed to have created the world's first fully cultivated burger. Now, it came at a cost of $330,000 to produce one burger, so not very scalable at that cost. But let's fast forward to 2020, and the idea that it could be commercial was first adopted then by Singapore, who were the first country in the world to commercially sell cultivated meat. And it was just chicken nuggets. That's the first thing they did, was selling chicken nuggets. The company's called Eat Just, probably a bit of a play on words about ethics and food there, but I think that's a pretty good number, pretty good name, sorry. But in 2023, the US joined Singapore and gave FDA approval to two companies. They are called Upside Foods and Good Meat, confirming that they were allowed to produce and sell cultivated chicken. So by now, by the time you're watching this video, cultivated meat not only exists, but it's for sale in certain places around the world. I will cover more of that. Let's keep going. Now, the thing I was most interested about when we picked this topic to explore and research, how? I can't even imagine how this begins, but now that I've done the research, I can share with you, and I'll try and keep it concise. So I've got it written down here. It's a bit like brewing beer, they say, quite similar to the brewing process. So any craft beer fans watching, this might feel familiar to you. It all starts with a biopsy, a sample of meat from a living animal, the animal whose meat you would like to reproduce. It's just a few cells, generally muscle cells, and it does not harm the animal. So that's the start. Next, you do cell banking, which is where you select and screen the different cells that you've taken to create a cell bank and understand what the different cells are. That's how you get your starter culture for creating the meat. The next one, you're going to need bioreactors. So you take the banked cells and then you put them into large vessels. These are the bioreactors. They're basically like big sterile tanks where the cells kind of fed into this nutrient-rich broth, and things start to happen with all the amino acids and the vitamins and sugars, and it's kind of replicating what might be happening inside an animal's body, right? And so when all these things come together, cells start to multiply. So in a way, you're creating life, not just meat, although it's not sentient. So that's probably the stark difference there. But then as the cells grow and get bigger, they begin to differentiate. So they turn into different types of cells. So some could become muscle, some could become fat. And with a bit of help and guidance from the scientists, they can push them in the right direction to become the kind of meat that they want to create. And then finally, harvesting and processing. So they take what's been grown in these bioreactors and they process it into things like, let's say, chicken mince, chicken nuggets, chicken patties, because what they've created is a cultivated meat. It resembles and tastes like meat. That's been the whole objective. And at this point, if you've got to that point, then they've succeeded. And I think it's utterly bizarre, but very interesting, right? Now, some of you watching may have another question in mind. Is it actually good for you? Is it healthy? Is it a good source of protein? The gym heads watching this will be wondering, can it help me get my daily protein intake? Well, there are some potential health benefits, so let's start with the pros. Cultivated meat, it's grown in this highly controlled environment, so it's sterile, and therefore very, very reduced risk, or zero risk in some cases, of pathogens. So things like E. coli, listeria, salmonella, these kind of foodborne diseases, almost no chance of that happening. So the chances of having a foodborne illness come close to zero, and that will be attractive to a lot of people who have a particularly sensitive stomach or even just a bad run with food choices. Now, one of the main issues that, let's say, vegans and anti-meat people say about real meat or animal-based meat is that they have to give a lot of medicines and antibiotics to farm animals because the environment and being around all these other animals and hygiene protocols and everything means that they're not always going to be the healthiest animals. And so you then consume these antibiotics and other medicines, and that's not great for your body. So one of the benefits of cultivated meat is there are none of that. There's nothing added. It is pure meat. I would imagine a lot healthier for that. Now, the final point of this meat by design is that scientists, as I said, could guide cells in different directions. And this is very interesting because it means they could actually create the meat for optimal health, right? They can kind of choose its fat content, its acid content, and it could have a much healthier profile than real meat, not just not having antibiotics and stuff in it, but actually the cellular makeup of the meat can be designed to be much healthier with extra vitamins and minerals, iron, B12, things like that. Who knows? They could even increase the protein content. So gym heads, keep an eye on this because it could be the future of what you eat. It's not all good news. There are some cons. It's not perfect, so it's less obvious than the pros. But when you look at the cons, it's more about the unknowns because this is such a young industry, such a nascent space. One of the issues here is not the cells, but the other stuff, right? This culture that they create, what goes into that, the growth factors involved to create this meat. There's a lot of unknowns in that process. And so, companies are using things like fetal bovine serum, and we don't really know the long-term effects of ingesting that every day. It could end up actually being really bad for you. Now, if we go back to the antibiotic debate, which is a really big debate, I get that. what happens when your cultivated meat has no immune system and no natural defense to protect it? It means that there are contamination risks. You assume that this meat is being grown in sterile labs, but there is always the chance that the environment's not entirely sterile, and so there's this little contamination risk. And even think about like the microbial content of the culture in the bioreactors. One small thing can go wrong, and that one small thing can create a big problem and ruin an entire batch, and force, I don't know, a recall or a cancellation. That then pushes up costs. It makes things harder to do for the meat creators. The other issue, meat nutritional equivalence, right? This is not the same as real meat. Because we're able to, or scientists, sorry, are able to manage some of the content of this cultivated or cell-based meat, it's not a one-for-one likeness. And so our bodies are accustomed to, the nutritional content of chicken, let's say, but there may be big variations in this new kind of meat that our bodies don't actually like. We don't know still about the effects of that in the long run. Before I move on to the next section, the final con, it's more of a personal one. Some people will look at this and be like, I don't want to eat it because I know it's not real meat. There's a psychological barrier for me as a bit of a blocker. Is it natural? This is science food. This is lab food. And so there's going to be a big marketing job for sure to convince consumers to eat this stuff. That is part of the discussion. I don't know if it's completely a con or a negative about this, but it's definitely something that consumers will have to think about, and the sellers, producers of this stuff will really need to carefully market. I've mentioned this before here on Substream, but many years ago I worked in sustainability. So with a lot of these stories that we share on this channel, I'm looking at the sustainability angle. I'm thinking, how does this affect the planet and our resources? Is it energy efficient? Things like that. And I have good findings from cell-based meat in that it really, really is good for the environment if it was to be scaled up. And one of those is from the drastic reduction in land use. Now, I used to live in Ecuador in the Andes, close to the Amazon, and I saw the Amazon getting smaller. I saw deforestation for cattle raising firsthand, and it's horrible because, I eat beef. I know I'm part of the problem, but I love the Amazon and jungles and rainforests, and it's a ethical quandary, right? But if we were to create meat, then we don't have to cut down the forests or jungle or whatnot. So the statistics say that if we were to switch to cultivated meat and adopt it en masse, then deforestation would reduce between 64 to 90%. That's a huge amount of land, and then it would allow us to rewild important pieces of land. And of course, if you're using less land and you're not having to rear animals, you're not using as much grain, you're not having to give them water, you're not having to do irrigation and things like that. So water use is down 96%. I think that's one of the best reasons for this industry to grow. Of course, maybe not of course, actually, maybe some of you don't know, but one of the biggest polluters on this planet is actually cows, who fart a lot of methane into the environment. And that's one of these issues with like greenhouse gases and the ozone layer, But if you reduce conventional agriculture and switch to cultivated meat, there will be less of that. But it also means there will be fewer animals alive. So it's a difficult one, I think, for the vegan community, let's say, who want animals to live free and have happy lives, but the reality is if people stop eating meat, there will be fewer animals born and have the chance to live. So that's a tricky one. But you put all of that together with methane and land and water, basically you're reducing pollution and resource usage, which is good for planet Earth. That's the summary of that. But of course it's not perfect. Substreamers, I knew you were expecting it. I did find some negatives, and when you think about it, these bioreactors, I'm actually not quite sure how much meat one bioreactor makes, quite how big it is. It's hard to find this information exactly. but they take a lot of energy. That is what I did find. They need precise temperatures. They need to maintain pH levels and oxygenization, and it's actually a lot of stuff. And obviously, energy is coming from fossil fuels in most cases, but if they're able to power these bioreactors with renewable energy, it drops down a lot. It could be a much better solution. Maybe that's something to work towards for the future. Now, the culture that I've talked about, this mix of nutrients and stuff, is actually has quite a high environmental footprint just to create the culture. So it's not perfect. You do have to find these resources and ingredients to put into it, and there is still going to be waste streams. It's unavoidable in the cultivation process, let's say, of this meat. There is waste. There just is. And when you scale all of this, it means more fossil fuels, more bioreactors, more people, more energy, more facilities. There is a huge opportunity cost here to do it. So, I'd say there's a lot of benefits to people and to the environment. It's very promising. The path forward looks pretty exciting, but there's definitely challenges and hurdles that have to be crossed along the way. Where can you get it? So far, I actually only found 4 places where you can get it. I've already mentioned Singapore. In the US, you've got Good Meat and Upside Foods. And then you've also got Australia and Israel. They're the 4 countries that already sell it or have approved it, are in the process of creating it, selling it. They're all at different stages. It's hard to know really how accurate and up-to-date this information is that I've got from my research, because they're not as transparent as I would like them to be. Now, there's other countries who have done the other thing, and they've banned them, right? I know Italy, for example. Italy just said, no, we're banning it. We don't want to deal with it. We want to protect our traditional agriculture. We want to protect our industries and our farmers. That's valid, I think. And Florida and Alabama in the US have also banned it. And for now, I think they're the only ones who've explicitly banned it. Now, I did mention the cost. Remember that figure? $330,000 to create one burger? Well, fortunately, we're not there. We've gone way beyond that. We've managed to push the prices right down to a point that's not too crazy. For people with more money, it's still a bit spenny, a bit expensive, but I think it's okay, because now apparently production costs are between like $17 upwards, right? Generally for commercial meat, between $17 and $63, that's the figures I found, or between $8 and $29 per pound for my American viewers. That's a lot less. That's a huge improvement. But it's going to be hard to push that down until they have commercial success to be able to scale it up. So, there's like the scales have to balance for a while until it's feasible to do this and take it to the next level and get it more affordable for the mass adoption. I did find this statistic from like the cultivated meat market and industry and stuff. They believe that the market will be worth $10 billion by 2033. 8 years from now. That's not a huge market. I think that's a very conservative estimate, but their goal is for price parity. So I think once they reach price parity, that market's going to absolutely explode, because, if you're looking at the 2 meats in the supermarket next to each other, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, I'll give this a go. And if it tastes fine and it's healthier and better for the planet, and they can, put their heart and mind into it, and it all aligns with their values, they'll stick with it. What do I think? I'm going to give you my take on this. I think it's not here to try and replace meat completely. I think it's here to complement the meat industry whilst providing an alternative argument, an opportunity for us to reduce our over-reliance on farm cultivated meat or farm agriculture, let's say. There's a lot of people who have switched to plant-based products and gone away from eating meat. They're doing their good for the planet. You may have your own feelings about that, but it does reduce meat consumption. This would allow meat consumption to maintain itself while getting some of the benefits of plant-based alternatives or non-meat alternatives. And I think that is definitely something worth exploring. And we got a rising global population. We have to find ways for people to get their protein and sustainably manage food security for that growing population. So I do think that is going to be very important for the future. I think there's going to be a challenge about taste, texture, consistency, about nutritional content, protein content, and getting it to the point, because I've never tasted it, getting it to the point where every single blind taste test gives the result, the desired result, which is that people absolutely cannot tell the difference. And if we can get to that point, I just don't see it failing. Substreamers, you did it. You got to the end of the video. To conclude, it is a bit sci-fi, but it's also a bit cool. It could be the future. Change and resistance go hand in hand. So while now you might be thinking, don't want some bioreactor grown meat, in 5 years from now, when you see it in the supermarket, you might feel differently. You might open your mind to it. If you can't tell the difference, who knows? You may go to a restaurant and see on the menu, different options. Oh, do you want pork? Do you want beef? Or do you want cultivated chicken? You might think, do you know what? That's a healthier option. And if the price is the same, why not give it a go? So who knows, really? There's so many unknowns. That's a bit of a theme throughout this video. There are a lot of unknowns, but I think that's exciting. I think it's all really exciting, and I want to know what you think. Thank you very much for watching. If you don't remember my name, I'm Joseph. This is Substream. You're a Substreamer now. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video, I hope. See you next time. Bye-bye.